The weight of silence is sometimes louder than any scream. In the waiting room of City General Hospital, that truth hung in the air like an invisible mist, touching each person seated in the faded blue plastic chairs. It was a typical autumn Thursday, when leaves begin to wither and the sky takes on melancholic hues that seem to reflect the deepest feelings of the human soul. Helen adjusted the blanket over her daughter Sophia's shoulders. 7-year-old Sophia was sleeping restlessly in her lap. The little girl had spent the previous night with a high fever, delirious with stray words that only a mother could decipher as silent cries for help. Sophia's brown hair was plastered to her sweaty forehead, and her slightly parted lips let out a labored, heavy breath that made Helen's heart contract with each exhalation. Helen wasn't a woman who drew attention. At 32, she carried the weight of raising a daughter alone, working double shifts at a clothing factory on the outskirts of the city. Her hands, calloused from hard work, trembled slightly as she stroked her daughter's hair. It wasn't from nervousness, but from exhaustion. She had arrived at the hospital at 5 in the morning, after a sleepless night, and now at 11 o'clock, she was still waiting in the triage line. Her factory uniform, a gray outfit that had seen better days, was wrinkled. Helen hadn't had time to change. When Sophia started convulsing from the fever, she simply picked up her daughter, grabbed the first blanket she found, and ran to the bus stop. After 2 bus rides, they arrived at the public hospital, the only one she could afford. Around them, the waiting room buzzed with the pain of others. An elderly man coughed at regular intervals, covering his mouth with an overused handkerchief. A pregnant woman massaged her belly, whispering words of comfort to the unborn baby. Children cried, adults sighed, and the sound of the old air conditioner created a melancholic soundtrack for this theater of human needs. Helen watched all this with the tired eyes of someone who knew this environment well. Sophia had been born in that same hospital 7 years earlier. Since then, between routine checkups and a few emergencies, mother and daughter had become familiar faces to some staff members. But familiarity, Helen had learned, didn't always mean priority. At the triage desk, a middle-aged nurse attended to patients with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had repeated the same gestures for decades. Her name, embroidered on her white coat, read Marcia. She had small eyes behind gold-rimmed glasses, and an expression that seemed permanently weary. She wasn't a bad person, Helen knew that. She was just someone who had learned to protect herself from the pain of others by creating an invisible barrier between herself and the patients. "Next," Marcia called out without looking up from her paperwork. Helen slowly got up, trying not to wake Sophia. The girl weighed little for her age, a consequence of not always having enough to eat. But hours in Helen's lap, her arms began to tingle. She approached the desk, adjusting her daughter more comfortably. "Good morning," Helen said softly, almost whispering. "My daughter has had a fever for 2 days. Yesterday she had a seizure." Marcia quickly looked up, assessed Sophia for a few seconds, and went back to writing on the paper. Child's full name? Sophia Helena Silva. Age? 7 years old. Health insurance card? Helen handed over her laminated card, already worn at the edges. Marcia typed it into the system, made some notes, and returned it. "You can sit down. They'll call you when it's your turn." "But," Helen hesitated, "she had a seizure. Shouldn't this be urgent?" Marcia sighed, a sound Helen already knew. It was the sigh of bureaucracy, of overload, of the impossibility of attending to everyone with the attention they deserved. Helen nodded and returned to her seat. She knew it was no use insisting. She knew the unwritten rules of this place. Patience was a mandatory virtue. Complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. She sat down again, settled Sophia in her lap, and continued to wait. Next to her, an elderly woman with white hair watched everything attentively. She was there with her grandson, a boy of about 10 who had hurt his arm riding his bike. The woman, whose name was Mrs. Antonia, had those kind eyes that only grandmothers possess, able to see pain where others only see routine. Across the room, near the coffee and soda machines, 3 young men were talking in low tones. They were medical students in their final year, doing an internship at the hospital. They wore impeccable white coats and carried stethoscopes around their necks as symbols of knowledge still under construction. Raphael, the most observant of the 3, had noticed Helen since she arrived. Something in the way she held her daughter, in the gentle way she adjusted the blanket, in the infinite patience with which she waited, touched a sensitive chord in his heart. He himself had been raised by a single mother, and recognized the signs of someone who gives everything for her children. "That woman over there," he whispered to his friends, "has been here with her daughter for hours. The child looks like she has a high fever." Bruno glanced in the indicated direction and shrugged. "That's just how it works here. Triage by severity. If it's not an emergency, you wait." Andrew, who came from a more affluent family and was still adjusting to the realities of the public health system, grimaced. "But look at the girl. She's clearly debilitated." "Welcome to the public health system," Bruno retorted cynically. "Everyone waits here." Raphael didn't respond, but continued watching. There was something about Helen's quiet dignity that bothered him, not in a negative sense, but in a way that stirred an inner unease, a desire to do something. Hours crawled by. Noon came and went. Helen had brought a bottle of juice for Sophia, which the girl sipped slowly when she could stay awake. The fever didn't relent, and Helen felt her daughter getting weaker. She herself hadn't eaten anything since the night before, but hunger was the least of her worries. Around 2 in the afternoon, something shifted in the waiting room dynamic. A well-dressed man in a navy blue suit and polished shoes entered, accompanied by a stylish woman and a seemingly healthy child who had only cut her finger playing. They went straight to the triage desk, ignoring the formed line. Helen watched without judgment, but with a pang of sadness. She knew how the world worked. Money, connections, appearance, all of it influenced care, even in a public hospital. The man spoke in a low tone to Marcia, who immediately called a doctor. Within 15 minutes, the family was being seen. Mrs. Antonia, who had also observed the scene, shook her head in disapproval. "It's always been this way," she muttered. "Some wait, others jump the queue." Helen didn't respond. She didn't have the energy for indignation. All her strength was focused on Sophia, who was now trembling slightly, despite the high fever. That's when Raphael approached. He had spent the last 2 hours thinking, observing, feeling that unease grow in his chest. He approached slowly, with the respect of someone who doesn't want to invade a private space of grief. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I'm a medical student. Could I take a look at your daughter?" Helen looked up, surprised. For hours she had felt invisible in that place. Suddenly, someone saw her, recognized her as a human being worthy of attention. She has a very high fever," Helen said, her voice choked. Raphael knelt beside the chair, bringing himself to Sophia's level. With gentle movements, he touched the girl's forehead, observed her breathing, noticed the pallor of her skin. "How long has she been like this?" 2 days. Yesterday she had a seizure. I brought her in early this morning, but you've been waiting since early this morning," Raphael finished, understanding. He stood up, with a thoughtful expression. He looked at the triage desk, where Marcia continued her mechanical routine. He looked at his colleagues, who watched him curiously. He looked again at Helen and Sophia. At that moment, something crystallized within him. It wasn't about medicine, protocols, or hierarchies. It was about humanity. It was about recognizing that sometimes rules need to bend before the most basic human need, to be seen, to be cared for, to matter. Raphael walked to the triage desk with determined steps. His white coat, which before was just his student uniform, now carried the weight of a greater responsibility. "Marcia," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "I need to talk to you about the child over there." The nurse looked up, slightly irritated by the interruption. "What is it, Raphael?" "The girl has had a fever for 2 days. She's had a seizure, and she's been waiting for over 8 hours. I think we should prioritize her." Marcia sighed again. "Raphael, you're still a student. You can't interfere with triage." "I'm not interfering, I'm observing, and what I see is a child who needs immediate medical attention." The conversation began to attract attention. Other patients looked discreetly. Raphael's colleagues approached, unsure whether to support him or try to calm him down. Bruno pulled his friend by the arm. "Raphael, calm down. That's not how it works." But Raphael gently pulled away. He was sure he was doing the right thing, even if it was against the unwritten rules of that place. "Marcia," he continued, now in a louder voice that echoed through the waiting room, "that mother has been there since 5 in the morning. She works in a factory. She probably lost a day's pay to be here. Her daughter is clearly debilitated, and we're letting her wait because... why?" The ensuing silence was thick. Everyone in the waiting room stopped what they were doing. Helen, who until then didn't fully understand what was happening, realized that someone was speaking for her, for Sophia, for all the mothers who waited invisibly in those blue plastic chairs. Marcia blushed, torn between irritation and embarrassment. She knew Raphael was right, but she also knew the pressures of the system, the overload, the impossibility of attending to everyone ideally. "Raphael, you don't understand how this works here," she said, trying to keep her voice low. "I understand perfectly," Raphael replied, now speaking to the entire room. "I understand that we have protocols. I understand that there's an overload. I understand that we can't always do what we'd like. But I also understand that medicine is about people. And that person over there," he pointed delicately to Helen, "is a mother who needs our help." Mrs. Antonia began clapping slowly. Others in the room joined her. It wasn't a boisterous or aggressive demonstration, but a quiet acknowledgement that someone had spoken a truth everyone felt but no one had dared to voice. And here, at this moment where humanity transcends rules, I need to pause the story to speak directly to you, following this narrative. If stories like this touch your heart, if you believe that small acts of courage can change the world, I invite you to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, because it's by sharing these reflections, these lessons in humanity, that we can, together, create a wave of empathy that goes far beyond the screens. Your subscription isn't just a click, it's a vote of confidence that stories that matter should continue to be told. And now, let's return to Helen, Sophia, and Raphael, because what happens next will touch your heart even more deeply. Marcia looked around, feeling the weight of all those eyes on her. For a moment, the masks fell away. The seasoned nurse, the bureaucracy, the mechanical routine, all of it dissolved, revealing only a woman who deep down had also chosen the healthcare field to care for people. She slowly stood up, walked to Helen, and spoke in a soft voice. "Come with me. Let's see your daughter now." Helen felt tears well up instantly. They weren't just tears of relief, but of gratitude for finally being seen, for having her pain recognized as valid and urgent. Raphael helped Helen to her feet, gently supporting Sophia's weight. As they walked toward the examination room, he whispered, "Your daughter will be all right. You're a brave mother." Helen couldn't answer. The words were caught in her throat, mixed with emotion and hope. In the examination room, the doctor on call, a 50-year-old man named Dr. Henrique, carefully examined Sophia. He had witnessed the scene in the waiting room and been moved by Raphael's initiative. While listening to the girl's heart, he gently talked to Helen, explaining each procedure, reassuring her.
"She has a bacterial infection," he said after the exams. "Nothing serious if treated properly. We'll medicate her here, and she should improve in the next few hours." Helen cried with relief. Sophia, already medicated and with her fever starting to subside, slept peacefully on the examination table.
Henrique approached Rafael, who was waiting in the hallway. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For reminding me why I chose to be a doctor." Rafael smiled, but there was a new seriousness in his eyes. That experience had changed something within him, crystallized an understanding of what it truly meant to care for people. 2 hours later, Helen left the hospital with Sophia in her arms. The girl was awake, still weak, but visibly better. She held a lollipop a nurse had given her, and her eyes already shone again with the vibrancy typical of childhood. At the exit, they encountered Rafael, who was finishing his internship shift. "How is she?" he asked, smiling at the sight of Sophia awake. "Much better," Helen replied. "Doctor, I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. You just need to take good care of her." Helen hesitated for a moment, then said, "You know, I work in a factory. I earn little. I live with little. But today you taught me that there are riches you can't buy. Thank you for seeing me, for seeing my daughter." Raphael felt a lump in his throat. He understood at that moment that he had received far more than he had given. Helen had taught him about dignity, about quiet strength, about the value of each human life. "Thank you, Helen, for letting me help." They walked toward the bus stop, Sophia nestled in her mother's lap, Helen's steps lighter despite her tiredness. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and the world seemed a little different than it had been that morning. Mrs. Antonia, who had witnessed everything, approached Raphael before leaving with her grandson. "Boy," she said, with the wisdom of years, "you did a beautiful thing today. Never forget this lesson." "What lesson?" "That medicine isn't just about curing diseases. It's about healing people. And sometimes healing people is simply seeing them." Raphael nodded, keeping those words in his heart. In the days that followed, the story spread through the hospital corridors, not as gossip, but as an example. Other students began paying more attention to the patients in the waiting room. Some doctors revisited their own practices. Marcia, the triage nurse, began to look longer at each person who approached her desk, trying to see beyond the symptoms and protocols. Sophia recovered completely in a week. Helen returned to work at the factory, but she carried with her a precious lesson. Even in the most difficult moments, when everything seems lost, someone may appear who sees our humanity and decides to act. Raphael graduated from medical school 2 years later. At the graduation ceremony, he invited Helen and Sophia to attend. He had specialized in pediatrics, inspired by that day at the hospital. In his speech as valedictorian, he spoke about the importance of seeing each patient as a whole person, with unique fears, hopes, and stories. "Medicine," he said to the audience, "teaches us about anatomy, physiology, pathology, but it's the patients who teach us about humanity." In the audience, Helen cried quietly with pride. Sophia, now 9 years old, healthy and full of energy, whispered, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor like Dr. Raphael." Helen smiled, stroking her daughter's hair. "You can be anything you want, my love. The important thing is to always remember to see people." Years later, Raphael opened a low-cost clinic in the neighborhood where Helen lived. He didn't get rich, but he found a different kind of wealth, the satisfaction of caring for those most in need, of being the person he wished had cared for his own mother when he was a child. Helen continued working at the factory, but occasionally visited the clinic when Sophia had routine checkups. She and Raphael developed a friendship based on mutual respect and shared gratitude. He had saved Sophia that day, but she had saved something in him too, the ability to be outraged by injustice and to act to correct it. Sophia grew up strong and determined. At 16, she won a scholarship to medical school. The day she received acceptance, she ran to tell Raphael, who cried with emotion as if it were a fatherly pride. "You inspired my daughter," Helen told him. "She wants to be a doctor because of you." "No," Raphael replied. "She wants to be a doctor because of herself. I just showed her it's possible." Mrs. Antonia, the elderly woman who had witnessed everything in the waiting room, passed away at 85, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. At her funeral, many people shared stories about her kindness, her ability to see the best in people. Raphael was there, paying his respects to the woman who had been a silent witness to his transformation. Marcia, the triage nurse, retired after 30 years of service. At her farewell party, she told the story of Raphael and Helen to her younger colleagues. "I learned that day," she said, "that protocol is important, but humanity is essential. Never forget that. Behind every medical chart is a person with fears, hopes, and a unique story." The hospital waiting room remained a place of encounters between pain and hope. New Helens arrived daily, carrying their Sophias in their arms, waiting with the infinite patience of mothers. And new Raphaels passed through, learning that medicine is both science and art, both technical knowledge and human sensitivity. But the greatest lesson from that autumn Thursday remained echoing in the memories of all who witnessed it. Sometimes the difference between despair and hope lies in a simple gesture of acknowledgement, in someone who chooses to see beyond the surface and act out of compassion. Helen never forgot Raphael's words, "You are a courageous mother." In the most difficult moments that were yet to come, because life never ceases to present challenges, she remembered those words and found the strength to continue. Sophia became a pediatrician, specializing in the care of children from low-income families. In her clinic, she kept a framed photograph, herself at 7 years old, in her mother's arms in the waiting room of that hospital. It was her daily reminder of why she had chosen that profession. Raphael, now experienced and respected in his field, continued teaching medical students. His first lesson always began with the same story, that of a mother who waited 8 hours in the waiting room with her feverish daughter, and how a simple act of seeing and acting transformed not only that day, but many lives. Medicine, he always said, is not about saving lives. It's about honoring lives. And honoring a life begins with seeing it. The hospital where it all happened underwent renovations over the years. The waiting room got more comfortable chairs, new air conditioning, and more welcoming decor. But the essence remained the same, a place where people in their most vulnerable moments sought relief from their pain. A discreet plaque was placed on the wall of the new waiting room. "Every person who passes through here has a story. Every story deserves respect." Few knew that this phrase had been suggested by a former medical student who, years earlier, had learned one of the most important lessons of his life there. The story of Helen, Sophia, and Raphael never made the news. It didn't appear on television or go viral on social media. It was just a moment of humanity on an ordinary day, witnessed by a few people in a public hospital waiting room. But its importance lay not in its public dimension, but in the silent transformation it generated. Because the greatest revolutions are not always the ones that make noise. Sometimes they are the ones that happen in the silence of the heart, when someone decides they can no longer pretend not to see the suffering of others. They are the ones that are born from a simple impulse, to lend a hand to those in need, to use one's voice for those who cannot speak, to be a bridge between despair and hope. Helen remained the same hard-working, simple woman who raised her daughter with love and determination. But she carried with her the certainty that there were good people in the world, people willing to see beyond appearances and act out of compassion. This certainty strengthened her in the difficult times she would still face. Sophia grew up knowing that she had been saved not only by medicine, but by the humanity of a young student who decided that she mattered. This lesson shaped her personality. She became someone who always saw others, who did not pass indifferently by the suffering of others. Raphael discovered his true calling that day. It was not just to cure diseases, but to care for people. It was not just to apply technical knowledge, but to practice medicine as an act of love for one's neighbor. His career was built on this solid foundation, the understanding that each patient is a unique universe that deserves attention, respect, and care. And so, 3 lives that crossed paths by chance in a waiting room transformed each other. Helen taught Raphael about dignity and quiet strength. Raphael taught Helen that there are people willing to see her humanity. Sophia, still a child, learned that the world can be a better place when people choose to care for one another. Raphael discovered his true calling that day. It was not just to cure diseases, but to care for people. It was not just to apply technical knowledge, but to practice medicine as an act of love for one's neighbor. His career was built on this solid foundation, the understanding that each patient is a unique universe that deserves attention, respect, and care. And so, 3 lives that crossed paths by chance in a waiting room transformed each other. Helen taught Raphael about dignity and quiet strength. Raphael taught Helen that there are people willing to see her humanity. Sophia, still a child, learned that the world can be a better place when people choose to care for one another. The true beauty of this story isn't in its happy ending, but in its simplicity. It didn't need extraordinary heroes, abundant resources, or special circumstances. It only needed an open heart, eyes that see beyond the surface, and the courage to act when action is needed. In a world that often seems divided, violent, and indifferent, stories like this remind us of a fundamental truth. We are all connected by our shared humanity. The pain of a mother who sees her child suffer is universal. The gratitude of someone who is helped is universal. The satisfaction of someone who helps is universal. The hospital continued to function, serving thousands of people every day. The waiting room continued to be the stage for personal dramas, hopes, and fears. But in that space, the memory of that Thursday remained alive, passed down from professional to professional, from patient to patient, as a reminder that small acts of kindness can have extraordinary consequences. Helen, Sophia, and Raphael went on with their lives, each on their own path. But they remained connected by that moment of grace, when humanity prevailed over bureaucracy, when compassion conquered indifference, when someone decided that a mother and her daughter deserved to be seen, cared for, respected. Years later, when Sophia was a qualified doctor, she accidentally found an old photograph of the waiting room of that hospital, published in a local newspaper in an article about public health. In the photo, she could see her mother, young, holding a child in her arms, Sophia herself at 7 years old on the day that changed their lives. Sophia showed the photo to Helen, who smiled nostalgically. "Do you remember that day?" Sophia asked. "How could I forget?" Helen replied. "It was the day I learned that angels exist. Sometimes they wear white coats, sometimes they're just good people who decide to make a difference. And it was the day I decided I wanted to be a doctor," Sophia added. "No," Helen gently corrected. "It was the day you decided you wanted to care for people. Being a doctor was just the way you chose to do that." They were silent for a moment, looking at the photograph that captured a moment of their lives, but couldn't convey all the emotion, all the transformation, all the hope that moment had generated.
"Mom," Sophia finally said, "thank you for teaching me to see people. Thank you for reminding me every day that it was worth never giving up," Helen replied. And there, in the simplicity of that dialogue between mother and daughter, was the entire beauty of the story summarized. The love that multiplies when it is shared, the hope that is renewed when it is cultivated, the humanity that is strengthened when it is exercised. The photograph was framed and placed in Sophia's clinic next to the other one she already had. Two images that told the same story from different perspectives, that of the one who is helped and that of the one who offers care. Patients who visited the clinic sometimes asked about the photographs. Sophia always told the story simply, without dramatizing, just sharing a life lesson that had shaped her vocation. "When I was little," she would say, "my mother took me to the hospital because I was very sick. We waited a long time to be seen, but a medical student saw us, really saw us, and decided we deserved care. That gesture changed our lives." Some patients smiled, others were moved. Everyone understood, in some way, because everyone had gone through moments when they needed to be seen, recognized, cared for. Raphael, now director of the pediatrics department of the same hospital where it all began, maintained a routine he had developed over the years. Every Thursday, he would pass by the waiting room, not to supervise or control, but to observe, to remember, to reconnect with the purpose he had discovered in that place. On these visits, he sometimes saw other Helens, other Sophias, tired mothers holding sick children, worried parents waiting with infinite patience. And whenever possible, he would approach, talk, offer a word of comfort, or simply his presence. "Doctor," a young mother once said to him, "why do you always come here to talk to us? It's not your job." Raphael smiled, remembering a similar question he had asked himself years before. "Because it was here that I learned to be a real doctor," he replied, "and because you teach me every day why it's worth doing what I do." The young mother didn't fully understand, but she felt the genuine affection in those words.
It was the same affection that Helen had felt years before when a medical student decided that she and her daughter deserved attention. Mrs. Antonia, even after her passing, remained present in the story. Her grandchildren, who had grown up hearing about that day at the hospital, carried with them the lessons she had passed on. One of them became a social worker, inspired by his grandmother's stories about the importance of seeing the dignity in each person. Grandma always used to say, he would tell his coworkers, that the world changes when someone decides to see the other as a person. It seems simple, but it's revolutionary. Marcia, a retired nurse, lived her final years with the quiet contentment of someone who had fulfilled their purpose. She had become a mentor to younger nurses, always reminding them that behind every protocol there is a person with a unique story. "Efficiency is important," she used to say, "but humanity is essential. Never forget that." The hospital had grown, modernized, adapted to the times. But its essence remained, a place where lives intersect at their most vulnerable moments, where medicine meets humanity, where small gestures can have extraordinary consequences. In the hospital library, among medical textbooks and technical manuals, there was a special section with stories of patients who had left their mark on the institution. The story of Helen and Sophia was there, told simply but touchingly, serving as inspiration for new professionals. "This is one of the most beautiful stories we know," the librarian would often say to students researching humanization in medicine. "There are no extraordinary heroes, no medical miracles. There are only people who decided to be human to each other." Sophia, now established in her career, began writing articles on social pediatrics, always emphasizing the importance of seeing the child within the context of their family and social reality. Her texts were widely read and respected, not only for their technical knowledge, but for the human sensitivity they demonstrated. "Pediatric medicine," she wrote in one of her most famous articles, "doesn't just treat small bodies. It treats entire universes. The child, the family, the fears, the hopes, the dreams. When we care for a child, we care for this entire universe. Helen, at 50, continued working, but now as a supervisor at the factory. She had studied at night, improved herself, and grown professionally. The pride of seeing her daughter graduate from medical school had given her the strength to pursue her own dreams. "It's never too late to grow," she would tell younger colleagues. "Life taught me that when someone believes in us, we discover strengths we didn't even know we had." The story continued to multiply, like ripples spreading when a stone is thrown into water. Each person touched by that lesson of humanity carried the seed of transformation, planting it in other hearts, in other lives. One day, Raphael received a letter from a medical student from another state. She had read about his story in a book on hospital humanization and wanted to thank him. "Dr. Raphael," the letter read, "your story taught me that being a doctor is more than just knowing diseases. It's about knowing people. Yesterday, in the waiting room of the hospital where I'm doing my internship, I saw a situation similar to the one you experienced. An elderly mother waiting for hours with her disabled son. I remembered your story and decided to act. I don't know if I changed their lives, but I know they changed mine. Thank you for teaching me that medicine is an act of love." Raphael smiled as he read the letter. The story continued to spread, touching new people, generating new acts of kindness. That's how the world changed, not with grand heroic gestures, but with small acts of humanity that multiplied infinitely. Sophia received an offer to write a book about her experience. She hesitated initially, but Helen encouraged her. "Tell our story," she said, "not for us, but for the other mothers waiting in waiting rooms, feeling invisible. Tell it so they know that there are people who care." The book was published under the title Mom, I See You, and became a quiet but significant success. It didn't reach the bestseller lists, but it deeply touched everyone who read it. Copies were distributed free of charge in hospitals and health centers across the country. Raphael wrote the foreword to the book, where he said, "This is not a story about medicine. It's a story about what makes us human, the ability to see the other, to care, to act out of compassion. Helen and Sophia taught me that saving lives begins with seeing lives." The book launch was held in the library of the hospital where it all began. Helen, Sophia, Raphael, some colleagues, patients, and their families were present. It was a simple event, but filled with emotion. "When I was little," Sophia told the audience, "my mother took me to the hospital. We waited a long time. I was very sick. My mother was very worried. But a young student saw us, really saw us, and decided we deserved care. That gesture changed our lives and, I hope, will continue to change other lives through this book." Helen, who rarely spoke in public, asked to say a few words. "I just want to thank," she said with a choked voice, "thank you to everyone who cares for us when we need it. Thank you to the doctors, nurses, staff who work with love. And thank you to those who see us as people, not just as numbers or problems to solve." The audience was moved. There was something sacred, touching, and true there. It was the simplicity of gratitude, the beauty of mutual recognition, the strength of shared humanity. Raphael, at the end of the event, approached Helen and Sophia. "Thank you," he said simply. "We are the ones who should thank you," Helen replied. "No," Raphael insisted. "You taught me what truly matters. You continue to teach me every day." Sophia hugged Raphael, the man who had been instrumental in her development not only as a doctor, but as a person. And there, in that embrace, was the beauty of the story summarized. The love that multiplies when shared, the care that generates more care, the humanity that strengthens when exercised. Night fell over the city as everyone said their goodbyes. Helen and Sophia walked together to the bus stop, as they had done countless times over the years. But they were different now from the people who had arrived at City General Hospital that Thursday morning years ago. Helen was no longer just a single mother, struggling alone. She was a woman who had learned that there are good people in the world, people willing to see her humanity and act with kindness. This certainty had strengthened her, allowing her to grow and develop. Sophia was no longer just a sick child. She was a dedicated doctor, someone who had learned early on the value of caring for others, of seeing beyond appearances, of treating each person as a unique and precious universe. Raphael was no longer just a young medical student. He was an experienced professional, a leader in his field, someone who had built his career on the solid foundation of compassion and humanity. But the most important transformation wasn't individual, it was collective. The story had spread, touched other people, inspired new acts of kindness. Each person touched by that lesson in humanity carried within them the seed of transformation. The hospital continued to function, serving thousands of people every day. The waiting room remained a stage for personal dramas, hopes, and fears. But now there was something different in the air, a greater awareness of the importance of seeing each person as a whole human being, with a unique story worthy of respect. New employees were oriented not only on technical protocols, but also on the importance of humanizing care. The story of Helen, Sophia, and Raphael had become part of the institutional culture, a constant reminder that medicine is as much science as art, as much technical knowledge as human sensitivity. And so the story continued to live, not as a memory of the past, but as an inspiration for the present and the future. Because the best stories are those that don't end when they reach the end, but continue to spread, touching new people, generating new acts of kindness. In a world that often seems divided, indifferent, and competitive, stories like this remind us of a fundamental truth. We are all connected by our shared humanity. The pain of a mother who sees her child suffer is universal. The gratitude of someone who is helped is universal. The satisfaction of someone who helps is universal. The transformational power of the story lay not in its exceptionality, but in its universality. All of us, at some point in our lives, have been Helen, needing to be seen, recognized, cared for. All of us, at some point, can be Raphael, having the opportunity to see the other and decide to act with kindness. The greater lesson from that autumn Thursday remained echoing. Sometimes the difference between despair and hope lies in a simple gesture of acknowledgement, in someone who decides to see beyond the surface and act out of compassion. We don't need to be extraordinary to make a difference. We don't need abundant resources or special circumstances. We just need an open heart, eyes that see beyond the surface, and the courage to act when action is needed. The true beauty of the story lay in its simplicity and its ability to multiply. Each person touched by that lesson in humanity became a multiplier of kindness, an agent of transformation, a light in a sometimes dark world. And so, in the quiet of the night falling over the city, three lives that had crossed paths by chance remained connected by the invisible thread of gratitude, love, and shared humanity. Helen, Sophia, and Raphael continued on their paths, each on their own trajectory, but united forever by the memory of that moment of grace in which human kindness prevailed over indifference. The story ended, but its message remained eternal. In a world that needs more kindness, each of us has the power to be the difference someone needs. We just need to see, to decide, to be human.